I'll never forget the moment I realized my family was broken beyond repair. It wasn't a slow burn or a quiet drift apart. It was a single, shattering event. My parents called it a practical decision, even a joke, but as my grandma Eleanor shuffled into the greasy, fluorescent light of their diner's anniversary party, her head buzzed raw and patchy, I saw the truth. Huddled under the buzzing neon sign of the corner plate, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and the forced cheer of a few remaining loyal customers, she looked so small, so utterly humiliated. In that instant, I knew this wasn't about practicality. This was about cruelty, and I swore to myself that I would burn their world down before I let them hurt her again. Hey everyone, my name is Liam. I'm 26 years old, and I live in a small duplex on the west side of Cleveland. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. By day, I work in IT support for a downtown firm, untangling digital messes and helping people who've forgotten their passwords for the 10th time. It's a steady job that pays the bills, and most nights I just want to come home, order a pizza, and watch the Guardians game. Life is supposed to be simple, right? It was, for a while. But to understand how everything went so wrong, you have to understand how beautiful it was in the beginning. My best memories aren't from my parents' house, which always felt temporary, like a stage set. My real childhood happened in my grandma Eleanor's little brick bungalow over in Lakewood. That house had a soul. It smelled perpetually of cinnamon, baked apples, and the lemon polish she used on the dark wood floors. Every corner held a piece of my history. There was the worn-out green armchair where Grandpa Arthur used to sit, meticulously building model ships inside glass bottles. He'd let me watch for hours, his huge, gentle hands working with such patience, telling me that anything worth building takes time and care, Liam, especially a family. He passed away 4 years ago, and I swear, sometimes I can still smell the faint scent of wood glue and Old Spice in that corner of my memory. Grandma Eleanor was the heart of that home. She was a woman of quiet, unshakable strength, the kind of person who could calm a crying child with just a touch and a soft hum. Her silver hair was her pride and joy, long, thick, and always pinned up in an elegant twist that seemed to defy gravity. Grandpa Arthur used to joke that he fell in love with her hair first, and her second. On quiet evenings, I'd watch him gently brush it for her, their silence filled with a love so deep and comfortable it felt like the air itself was humming. That house, those moments, they were my anchor. It was a place where I knew, without a doubt, that I was loved and safe. But outside that bubble of warmth, things were different. My parents, Rick and Brenda, were always chasing something. Their dream was the Corner Plate, a little diner they bought 15 years ago with big hopes. But hopes don't pay the bills. The diner was a classic greasy spoon, stuck in time while the rest of the neighborhood modernized around it. My dad, Rick, had none of my grandfather's patience. He was a man of shortcuts and quick tempers. My mom, Brenda, measured happiness in dollar signs and spent her days with a permanently worried frown etched on her face. Their house always felt cold, filled with the low hum of anxiety and the rustle of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. I loved them because they were my parents, but I never felt the unconditional peace there that I felt with my grandparents. I just never imagined their desperation would curdle into something so dark. I never imagined it would lead them to destroy the one person who had only ever shown them love. The first domino fell about 3 months after Grandpa Arthur's 4th death anniversary. I got a call from my mom Brenda on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was unusually cheerful, syrupy sweet in a way that always set my teeth on edge. "Liam, honey, can you come over for dinner tonight? We're having a special family meeting. Your grandma has some wonderful news to share." Wonderful news in our house usually meant someone found a $20 bill in an old coat pocket, so the formality of it felt strange, almost theatrical. But I agreed, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach that I couldn't quite explain. When I arrived, the atmosphere was thick with a kind of forced pleasantry. My dad, Rick, was all smiles, patting my back a little too hard. My mom had made a watery pot roast, a dish reserved for major occasions. Grandma Eleanor was the only one who seemed genuine, though her eyes held a deep, swimming sadness that she was trying her best to conceal behind a gentle smile. We sat around the rickety dining table, the one with a wobbly leg my dad never got around to fixing. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, my mom cleared her throat, beaming at my grandmother. Go on, Mom. Tell him. Grandma Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her gaze drifting toward the window as if she were looking at something far away. Well, Liam, she began, her voice soft but steady, I've decided to sell the house. The words hung in the air, and for a second I thought I'd misheard. Sell the house? The brick bungalow? The home where she and Grandpa built a life? Where every floorboard held a memory? It seemed impossible, like saying you were going to sell the sky. Before I could process it, she continued, Your parents have worked so hard on the diner, your grandfather would have wanted me to help. So, I'm giving them the money to finally fix up the place and get back on their feet. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. My mother burst into performative tears, rushing over to hug Eleanor so tightly it looked like she might break her. Oh, Mom, you're our savior, our absolute angel, she sobbed into Eleanor's shoulder. My dad let out a huge, gusty sigh of relief, his face breaking into the first genuine smile I'd seen on him in years. We won't let you down, Mom. This is it. This is the fresh start we needed. We can get new booths, a new grill, maybe even that espresso machine Brenda's been wanting. He was already spending the money in his head, his eyes gleaming with a manic gold rush energy. They talked on and on about their plans, about how this single act would solve all their problems. And I just sat there, watching. I wanted to feel happy for them. I truly did. I wanted to believe this was a beautiful moment of a family coming together, but I couldn't shake the pit in my stomach. I saw the way my mom, in the middle of her tearful embrace, pulled back just enough to glance at her phone on the counter, as if she was expecting a bank notification to pop up at any second. I saw how my dad's relief wasn't about easing a burden, but about securing an investment. It hit me then that this wasn't a surprise to them at all. They had been working on this, pushing for this. I remembered a few weeks prior, stopping by to drop off groceries, and I'd overheard my mom on the phone with my dad in a hushed, urgent tone. She's thinking about it, she'd said. I just need to keep reminding her that a house is just bricks and wood, but family is everything. Hearing that now, in my memory, felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a sacrifice Eleanor had offered. It was one they had solicited, masterfully and without shame. A week later, the sold sign went up in front of the bungalow. I helped Grandma Eleanor pack up a lifetime of memories into a few cardboard boxes. She was quiet, but composed, holding on to the model ship Grandpa Arthur finished just before he died, as if it were a holy relic. Her new room at my parents' house was the small, drafty office at the back. It was painted a sterile beige and smelled faintly of dust and forgotten paperwork. As I set down the last box, she looked around the small space, so different from the warm, sunlit rooms of her home, and gave me a brave smile. It's a new chapter, Liam, she said, more to convince herself than me. I hugged her, feeling the frailness of her shoulders. She had given them her home, her security, her entire past. I walked out of that little beige room praying they understood just how much it was all worth. I had a terrible feeling they didn't. For the first month, a fragile peace held. The money from the sale of Eleanor's house was like a fresh coat of paint on a rotting wall. My parents were giddy with possibility. They bought the shiny new espresso machine Brenda wanted, installed cheap vinyl booths that smelled of plastic, and reprinted the menus on glossy cardstock. There was a brief, manic period of hope where they acted like loving, grateful children. But a new coffee machine doesn't fix a bad business model, and glossy menus don't change the fact that my father overcooks his eggs. Once the initial injection of cash was absorbed into the black hole of their debt, the old anxieties returned, but this time they were sharper, and they had a new target. My grandmother. The gratitude evaporated, and what was left was a cold, simmering resentment. The 1,000 paper cuts began. It started with small, insidious acts of erasure, usually framed as acts of care. One Saturday, I walked in to find my grandmother standing silently in the kitchen, her hands clasped in front of her. My mom was bustling around, humming a tune as she shoved a set of old, heavy baking pans into a trash bag. They were Eleanor's, the ones Grandpa Arthur had bought her for their first wedding anniversary. They were seasoned with 60 years of love and apple pies. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Brenda looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh, these old things? They're a mess. Besides, I don't want your grandma tiring herself out in the kitchen. She needs to rest." I looked at Eleanor. Her face was a mask of placid disappointment. She just wanted to contribute, to feel useful, But my mother had stolen that from her under the guise of concern, telling her without words, "You are no longer the matriarch here. You are a guest, and a temporary one at that." My father's cruelty was less subtle. He developed a habit of letting out a loud, theatrical sigh whenever Eleanor took more than a few seconds to lower herself into a chair or walk up the 2 steps from the living room. It was a sound full of impatience, a constant, audible reminder that she was slow, that she was an inconvenience. When she'd start to tell a story from her past, one of the beautiful, meandering tales I had cherished my whole life, my dad would cut her off. "All right, Mom, we get it. You walked uphill to school both ways," he'd say with a dismissive wave, winking at me as if we were sharing a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was a systematic dismantling of her voice. They were chipping away at her identity, one sigh and one interruption at a time, making her feel like her memories, the only things she had left, were worthless. The most infuriating part was their complete control over her. One afternoon, I slipped Grandma a $50 bill while my parents were at the diner. "Here," I whispered. "Go buy some of that nice yarn you like, or have a friend over for lunch." Her eyes lit up for a moment, a flash of the old independence. But my mother must have seen the exchange on the home security camera she'd installed. She confronted me later that evening, holding the $50 bill between her thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated. "Liam, we can't have you just giving her cash," she said in a low, patronizing tone. "She could lose it, or someone could take advantage of her. I'll hold on to it for her and buy her anything she needs." The way she said "needs" sent a chill down my spine. They hadn't just taken her home, they had taken her personhood. She wasn't allowed to have wants, only needs that they would dictate. I tried to fight back, but it was like punching smoke. Every time I confronted them, they would gaslight me. "You're being too sensitive," my mom would say, her eyes wide with false innocence. "We're doing our best. Taking care of an elderly parent is a huge sacrifice, you know." They painted themselves as martyrs while actively tormenting the person they were supposedly sacrificing for. The paper cuts kept coming day after day. They were small enough that, on their own, they might seem insignificant. But 1,000 tiny cuts can make you bleed to death. And as I watched my grandmother grow quieter and more withdrawn, I realized that's exactly what was happening. She was bleeding out, not blood, but spirit. Her light was dimming in that cold beige room, and I was the only one who seemed to see it, or care. The image of my grandmother, sitting alone in that sterile beige room, her hands folded in her lap as she stared at a blank wall, became seared into my mind. It haunted me at work, followed me home, and sat with me in the silence of my own apartment. I saw her vibrant spirit being systematically extinguished, and the passive anger I felt began to curdle into a desperate need to act. I couldn't be a bystander anymore. I couldn't just watch them crush the most important person in my life. I decided to confront them directly, hoping naively that a direct appeal to their conscience, if they had one left, might change something. I was wrong. I found them one evening at the diner, wiping down the counter after a slow dinner service. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice even. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk about Grandma. I'm worried about her. She seems so sad." My mother Brenda stopped wiping and placed the damp rag on the counter with a loud smack. Her face, which had been slack with fatigue, instantly hardened. "Sad? Liam, she has a roof over her head, a warm bed, and 3 meals a day that I cook for her. What on earth does she have to be sad about?" Her tone was sharp, defensive, immediately casting my concern as an accusation. My father chimed in, leaning against the coffee machine with his arms crossed. "We're doing everything we can for her, son. Your mother had to cut back her hours at the library just to be around. Do you have any idea the kind of sacrifice that is? And this is the thanks we get? You coming in here telling us we're not doing a good enough job?" It was a masterclass in manipulation. In under 30 seconds, they had twisted my genuine worry into an ungrateful attack on their martyrdom. They weren't listening. They were just reloading with ammunition of guilt. I pushed back, my voice rising with frustration. "It's not about the food or the roof. It's about how you talk to her. The way you sigh every time she moves, the way you dismiss her stories like they're nothing. You're making her feel worthless." My dad just scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, grow up, Liam. She's old. We're just trying to manage. You're being dramatic." The conversation was a brick wall. There was no empathy, no flicker of understanding. They didn't see a person. They saw a problem they were forced to manage. Defeated, I realized I couldn't change them. I could only try to rescue her. Later that night, I went to Eleanor's room and quietly closed the door behind me. She was sitting in her chair knitting, the click-clack of the needles the only sound. I knelt in front of her and took her hands in mine. They felt as delicate as dried leaves. "Grandma," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "please, come and live with me. I know my apartment is small, and it's not your beautiful house, but you'll have your own space. You'll be respected. I'll take care of you. We'll be happy." I looked into her eyes, pleading with her, hoping to see a spark of agreement. Instead, I saw a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She slowly pulled one of her hands away and cupped my cheek, her touch feather light. "Oh, my dear sweet boy," she whispered, and her eyes welled up with tears. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Your career, friends, maybe a family of your own one day. I can't be a burden to you." The word hit me like a physical blow. Burden. They had done it. They had made her believe it. She was now speaking their language, seeing herself through their cruel and unforgiving lens. "You could never be a burden to me," I insisted, my own tears starting to fall. But she just shook her head, a gentle, final gesture. "A family is supposed to stick together, Liam," she said, echoing the very words my mother had used to manipulate her. "This is just a rough patch. It'll get better." But we both knew it wouldn't. I left her room that night feeling a helplessness so profound it was suffocating. I had tried to reason with her captors, and they had laughed at me. I had tried to unlock the cage, and she had refused to leave, convinced it was where she belonged. I didn't know what else I could possibly do. I could only wait for the next terrible thing to happen. I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks later, my mother announced they were throwing a party to celebrate the diner's 25th anniversary. It was a desperate, transparent ploy to drum up business, disguised as a community celebration. She printed cheap flyers with a grainy photo of my parents from the 90 seconds, their smiles full of a hope that was now long dead. My first instinct was to refuse to go, to have no part in their charade. But then the thought of my grandmother, alone and navigating an entire evening of their forced festivities, filled me with a cold dread. I knew I had to be there. I had to be her anchor, her witness. I just had no idea what I was about to witness. I arrived at the corner plate to a scene of profound patheticness. A few dozen faded balloons were taped to the walls, some already sagging towards the floor. A fold-out table held a punch bowl filled with cheap grocery store sherbet and ginger ale, along with a plate of curling, pre-sliced cheese. The guest list was a motley crew of their oldest, most loyal customers, and a few neighbors who probably came out of a sense of pity. My parents were in their element, playing the role of gracious hosts. My dad, Rick, was laughing too loudly at his own jokes, and my mom, Brenda, drifted through the small crowd with a tray of burnt mini quiches, her smile stretched so tight it looked painful. I scanned the room for Eleanor, but she was nowhere to be seen. I asked my mom where she was. "Oh, she's just getting ready," Brenda said with a secretive little smile. She wanted to look special for the occasion. "Oh." An hour into the miserable affair, my mother clinked a spoon against a glass, calling for everyone's attention. The chatter died down. She launched into a rambling speech about the highs and lows of being small business owners, about their dedication to the community, and about the importance of families sticking together through thick and thin. She looked pointedly at me when she said that. "This last year has been tough," she said, her voice catching with practiced emotion. "But we've been so blessed to have my mother, Eleanor, come to live with us. Her support has meant the world." Then her smile turned brighter, sharper. "And in the spirit of supporting the family business, she's decided to make a little change herself, a more practical look for a woman of her years." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what was coming, but every instinct in my body screamed that it was something awful. Brenda walked over to the swinging door that led to the kitchen and pushed it open. "Everybody, let's give a round of applause for my mom, Eleanor." And then she led her out. The person who emerged was my grandmother, but it was a version of her I had never seen before. She was wearing a thin, faded floral scarf over her head, and she clutched its edges with trembling fingers. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor as my mother paraded her into the center of the room. A few people clapped uncertainly before the applause sputtered out into a thick, uncomfortable silence. The air in the room became heavy, charged with a collective, unspoken horror. With a grand theatrical gesture, my mother reached over and plucked the scarf from my grandmother's head, and then I saw it. Her beautiful, long silver hair, the hair Grandpa Arthur had loved so much, the hair she had so carefully pinned up every morning for 60 years, was gone. In its place was a brutal, patchy hack job. It wasn't a neat buzz cut. It looked like it had been done with dull clippers in the dark. Angry red scratches crisscrossed her pale scalp, where the blades had dug in too deep. She looked like a prisoner, a patient, a victim. She looked utterly and completely broken. She flinched under the greasy fluorescent lights, her hands flying up to cover her head as a tear finally escaped and traced a silent path down her wrinkled cheek. The room was deathly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. Then my mother, with a laugh as bright and brittle as shattering glass, addressed the stunned crowd. "We had to, for hygiene reasons, you know," she announced, her voice booming with false cheer. "With her helping out in the kitchen now and then, we just can't risk having hair in the food. It's better this way. So much cleaner." My father stood beside her, nodding and beaming like she'd just revealed the cure for cancer. The casual, public cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't about hygiene. This was a shaming. It was a branding. It was an act of supreme humiliation, performed in front of an audience to assert their absolute power over her. I looked around at the faces of the guests. I saw shock. I saw pity. I saw discomfort. But I saw no one, not a single person, step forward to say a word. In their silence, they were all complicit. The world seemed to slow down, the buzzing of the neon sign filling my ears. All I could see was my grandmother's terror, and the smug, triumphant smile on my mother's face. The helplessness I'd been feeling for weeks finally ignited. It burned away my shock and my sadness and left behind only a clean, white-hot, singular rage. The silence in the diner stretched for a long, agonizing moment, thick and heavy with shame, and then something inside me broke. The white-hot rage I felt finally found an exit, and it started in my feet. I moved. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I simply walked forward, my steps deliberate and heavy on the worn linoleum. The small crowd of guests parted from me, as if I were wading through water, their eyes wide, their faces a mixture of fear, and a strange, guilty relief that someone was finally doing something. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of my grandmother, placing myself between her and my parents. I gently took off my jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders, a small, inadequate shield against the prying eyes of the room. I kept my back to my parents, focusing only on her. "It's okay, Grandma," I whispered, my voice shaking with a fury I could barely contain. "I'm here. We're leaving." Then I turned. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of shocked indignation, her fake party smile frozen in place. I looked at my father, his jovial host persona collapsing into a dark, angry scowl. My voice, when it came out, was dangerously quiet. "What did you do?" Brenda was the first to recover, trying to seize control with a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Liam, don't be so dramatic. You're making a scene and ruining our special night." Her words were fuel on the fire. "Your special night?" My voice rose, cutting through the silence. "You call this a celebration? You take the woman who gave you everything, who sacrificed her home for you, and you scalp her in front of an audience for being an inconvenience? What kind of monsters are you?" My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a sad display of authority. "You watch your mouth, boy. This is my place, and that is your mother you're talking to. This is a private family matter." "This stopped being a private matter the second you decided to humiliate her for sport," I shot back, my voice now echoing in the silent diner. I looked past them, at the stunned faces of their friends and neighbors. "All of you, you see this, right? You see what they did?" No one met my gaze. They just stared at their shoes, at their half-empty glasses, anywhere but at the raw truth of the situation. That's when I knew there was nothing left to save here. I turned back to my grandmother and gently took her by the arm. "Let's go, Grandma." I started to lead her towards the door. My father grabbed my shoulder. "You're not taking her anywhere." I shook his hand off with a force that surprised us both. "Try and stop me," I snarled, my eyes locking onto his. For a second, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He backed down. As I walked Eleanor out the door, my mother's voice shrieked after us, a venomous, desperate sound. "Fine, go. Take the old woman. See how long you last before she drives you crazy too. Don't come crawling back to us. The cold night air hit us as the diner door swung shut behind us, cutting off her voice. The drive back to my duplex was the longest 15 minutes of my life. The car was filled with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. My grandmother sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the blurred city lights, her thin shoulders hunched over. She didn't cry anymore. She just breathed, each inhale a tiny, shaky shudder. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt pathetic. "It'll be okay," felt like a lie. So I just drove, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, the rage inside me slowly cooling from a raging fire into a hard, cold block of resolve. When we got to my apartment, I led her inside and sat her down on my old, comfortable couch. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness for her, for us. My hands were trembling slightly as I filled the kettle to make her some tea. I brought her the steaming mug and a thick wool blanket from my bed. I wrapped it around her, and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were vacant, filled with a depth of shame and pain that I knew I could never fully understand. I didn't ask her what happened. I didn't push her to talk. I just pulled the small coffee table closer, sat on the floor beside the couch, and waited. I would sit there all night if I had to. She was safe now. That was all that mattered. I had drawn a line in the sand. My parents were on one side, and my grandmother and I were on the other. And I knew with absolute certainty I would never, ever cross back over. We sat like that for what felt like hours, cocooned in the quiet of my small living room. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic on the late-night streets of Cleveland. The tea in my grandmother's mug grew cold, untouched. I didn't push, I didn't ask questions. I just stayed there on the floor, a silent guardian, letting her know she wasn't alone. The rage from the diner had settled deep in my bones, hardening into a cold, heavy certainty. But I knew I only had a piece of the story. I had seen the result, but I couldn't comprehend the cruelty of the act itself. Finally, in a voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the silence, she spoke. "It was the plates," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point somewhere beyond my apartment wall. "The new ones your mother ordered for the party." I waited, holding my breath. She took a shaky sip of her cold tea and continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength as she unburdened herself of the memory. "It was yesterday morning. I wanted to help. I always just want to help. Brenda was rushing around, stressed about the party, and she asked me to wash the new dinner plates. They were heavy, and my hands, they don't work like they used to. The arthritis gets bad when it's damp." She looked down at her own gnarled knuckles as if they were traitors. "I had a stack of them. I was being so careful, Liam, but my grip just gave out. They slipped." She paused, and I could picture the scene with perfect, sickening clarity. The loud, echoing crash of shattering ceramic on the cheap diner floor. "Brenda!" she exploded. Eleanor said, her voice trembling. It wasn't just anger. It was hatred. She started screaming that I was a useless, clumsy old woman, that everything I touched, I broke. She said I was a liability, a walking disaster that she was sick of cleaning up after. My stomach twisted into a knot. I could hear my mother's shrill, blaming tone in my head. I tried to apologize, to offer to pay for them from my pension, but she wouldn't listen. She backed me into a corner of the kitchen. She said she was tired of my messes, tired of my hair, tired of me. Eleanor's voice cracked, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Your father was there." He came in from the dining room when he heard the crash. He just stood in the doorway, blocking it, watching. I looked at him, Liam. I begged him with my eyes to make her stop, to just say something. She looked at me now, her own eyes filled with a pain so deep it felt ancient. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. His face was completely blank, like he was watching a television show, like he wasn't even there. The complicity of his silence was, in some ways, worse than Brenda's rage. It was a silent endorsement, a permission slip. "Brenda went into the little back bathroom and came out with the electric clippers your father uses to trim his beard," Eleanor continued, her voice now a flat, monotone whisper, as if she were narrating a story that happened to someone else. She said if I couldn't keep my hair out of her way, then she'd do it for me. She said she was going to teach me a lesson about being neat. I tried to push past your father, but he just stood there, like a wall. He didn't touch me, but he didn't have to. He just let it happen. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I pictured my grandmother, frail and terrified, trapped between her daughter-in-law's manic rage and her own son's chilling indifference. She grabbed my hair and started cutting. It was rough. She didn't care if she hurt me. I could feel the blades scratching my scalp. I closed my eyes and I saw your grandfather's face. I saw him smiling, telling me my hair looked like spun moonlight. Her voice broke completely, and she started to sob, a raw, ragged sound that tore through the quiet of the room. I moved from the floor to the couch and wrapped my arms around her, holding her as she shook. "The worst part," she finally whispered into my shoulder, her voice muffled by the blanket. "The worst part wasn't the hair. It wasn't even the pain. It was watching it fall to the floor around my feet, all that was left of me, and the look on their faces." Brenda looked satisfied, triumphant. "And your father," he just looked bored. She had been punished. Not for breaking plates, but for being old, for being slow, for needing care. They had stripped her of her last piece of identity, of her connection to the man she loved, to prove that she was nothing more than an object in their house, an object they had complete power over. As I held her, my sorrow was so profound, it felt like a physical weight. But beneath it, the cold block of resolve in my gut was crystallizing, sharpening into a single, diamond-hard point. This was no longer just about protecting her. This was about a reckoning. They didn't just break some plates. They had tried to break a person, and I would spend the rest of my life making them understand what it meant to pay for something that was truly priceless. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. I had managed maybe an hour of restless sleep in the armchair, watching over my grandmother as she slept fitfully on the couch. The raw, gut-wrenching sorrow of the night before had cooled and hardened inside me, forging something new, a quiet, unshakable resolve. There was no more confusion, no more hope for reconciliation. There was only a cold, clear path forward. After making sure Eleanor was still resting peacefully, I drank a cup of black coffee, grabbed my keys, and drove back to that house one last time. I had to get her things. I had to erase her from that place completely. I used my old key to let myself in. The house was quiet, stuffy, and smelled of stale party food and regret. I found my parents at the kitchen table, nursing mugs of coffee. They looked haggard, their faces puffy from a combination of alcohol and anger. My mother Brenda looked up at me, her eyes narrowing with a familiar, bitter resentment. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Finally come back to your senses. Did you enjoy your little dramatic stunt?" My father didn't even look at me, just stared into his mug. "I figured you'd be back," he grumbled. "It's easy to play the hero for one night. The real world is a bit tougher." I didn't rise to the bait. I felt strangely calm, detached, as if I were watching this scene from a great distance. "I'm here for Grandma's things," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. I walked past them, ignoring Brenda's indignant gasp, and went straight to the small beige room at the back of the house. I found a few empty cardboard boxes in the closet and began to pack. It didn't take long. There wasn't much. I carefully wrapped the photo of Grandpa Arthur in a sweater. I collected her knitting basket, the worn copy of her favorite poetry book, and the small wooden music box he had given her on their 50th anniversary. These small, precious items felt like relics I was rescuing from a desecrated tomb. My parents appeared in the doorway, their presence filling the small room with a toxic energy. They watched me for a moment, unnerved by my silence. My calmness was something they didn't know how to fight. Finally, my mother couldn't stand it. "You can't be serious, Liam. You're really going to do this? After everything we've done for her? For you? Everything you've done?" I paused, looking up from folding one of her shawls. "You mean everything you've taken?" My father snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't you dare preach to us about morality. Do you have any idea what you're getting into? The doctor's appointments? The medications? The sheer boredom of it all? She's an old woman, Liam. It's not a weekend project." She's my grandmother," I said simply, turning my back on them to continue packing. His words were meant to be a warning, a threat, but they sounded like a confession of his own pathetic weakness. I could feel their frustration mounting, their inability to get a reaction from me infuriating them. As I taped up the last box and stood up, my father stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You think you're better than us, don't you? Fine, take her. She's your problem now. He spat the words out like a curse. She's your burden. I stopped in the doorway and turned to face them one last time. I looked at my father, at his weak, resentful face. I looked at my mother, her features twisted with spite. I saw them for what they truly were. Not parents, but hollowed, out people, consumed by their own bitterness. I felt nothing. No love, no hate, just a vast, empty distance. You've had it wrong this whole time, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. She was never the burden. I paused, letting the words hang in the dead air between us. The burden was having to pretend that this was a family. I saw a flicker of genuine shock in their eyes. It was the first time I had ever spoken to them without a shred of fear or deference. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up the boxes, walked past them without another glance, and left the house. As the front door clicked shut behind me, the sound was deafening. It was the sound of a chapter ending. The sound of a final, irreversible choice. The point of no return had been crossed, and I was walking into a new, uncertain future, with only my grandmother and the weight of her rescued memories by my side. Bringing those few boxes of my grandmother's life into my small apartment felt like a sacred act. We were refugees starting over. The first few days were a quiet adjustment, two people learning the rhythms of a new life in a space that was barely big enough for one. I turned my small spare room, which had been a chaotic graveyard of old computer parts and neglected workout equipment, into her bedroom. I bought her a new lamp, soft sheets, and a comfortable armchair that I placed by the sunniest window. It wasn't the brick bungalow filled with 60 years of memories, but it was safe. And for the first time in a long time, it was hers. Slowly, painstakingly, like a delicate flower recovering from a frost, Grandma Eleanor began to bloom again. The change happened in small, beautiful moments. One afternoon, I came home from work to the smell of cinnamon and baking apples. She had found a way to work in my tiny kitchen and had made her famous apple pie. It was the first time my apartment had ever truly felt like a home. A few days later, I found her humming an old tune from the 40 Seconds while she sat knitting, the soft click-clack of her needles a gentle, rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet apartment. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't heard her hum in years. My parents' house had been a place of silence and sighs. Mine was slowly filling with the soundtrack of her contentment. Her hair began to grow back, and though it was still brutally short, she started taking pride in it, asking me if it looked all right, a small but significant return of her sense of self. My proudest moment came when I bought her a simple tablet. At first she was intimidated by it, convinced she was too old to learn. But I sat with her for hours, patiently showing her how to tap the screen, how to find her favorite old movies, and most importantly, how to video call. I helped her connect with her old friend Carol, a woman she hadn't seen since moving in with my parents because they'd always made excuses for why Carol couldn't visit. When Carol's face popped up on the screen, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of pure joy. I left the room to give her privacy, and for the next hour, I could hear the sound I'd missed the most, my grandmother's full, uninhibited laughter, echoing from her little room. That sound was worth more than any sacrifice. But there were sacrifices. While Eleanor was rediscovering peace, I was discovering the crushing weight of responsibility. My IT salary was enough for a single guy living a simple life, but it was no match for the needs of two people, one of whom was an elderly woman with significant medical needs. The first time I went to the pharmacy to refill her heart medication, the bill was over $300. I paid for it with a credit card, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Then came the copays for doctor's visits, the higher grocery bills for the healthy food she needed, the cost of just keeping the apartment warmer for her old bones. My life became a secret second shift. After Eleanor went to bed, humming contentedly, my real work began. I'd sit at my kitchen table under a single dim light, a battlefield of bills and bank statements spread out before me. My student loan payment, the rent, the car insurance, and now a whole new column of expenses that made my modest income feel laughably small. I started eating ramen for dinner, telling her I'd already eaten at work. I took on freelance IT projects on the weekends, working late into the night while she slept, my eyes burning from staring at the screen. The calls started, too. Numbers from unknown area codes that I knew were debt collectors for the copays I'd let slide. I'd answer, see her looking at me with concern, and force a cheerful smile. "Wrong number," I'd say, hanging up as my heart hammered against my ribs. I was building a beautiful, peaceful world for her, but the foundations of that world were cracking under a financial strain I couldn't let her see. She had spent a lifetime worrying about her family. I was determined that she would never spend another second of her life worrying about me. I just didn't know how long I could keep the walls from caving in. The weeks bled into a month, then two. Our new life settled into a rhythm, a delicate dance of quiet joys and my own secret, frantic anxieties. I thought I was hiding it well. I'd come home from my long hours at work, force a bright smile, and ask Eleanor about her day, about her calls with friends, about the new knitting pattern she was trying. But I underestimated the wisdom of a woman who had spent nearly 80 years watching the world, a woman who knew my face better than I knew it myself. She saw the new, faint lines of stress around my eyes. She noticed I was getting thinner, that my clothes seemed to hang off my frame. She saw the way I'd quickly shove a stack of mail into a drawer when I came in, and she heard the forced cheerfulness in my voice when I answered calls from wrong numbers. Oh. One Saturday morning, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop and trying to figure out how to stretch my next paycheck, she came and stood behind me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You look tired, Liam," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through my fog of worry. "Turn that thing off. I need you to take me somewhere today. I need to go and see Arthur." Her request was quiet, but it felt like an order. I didn't argue. I shut the laptop, the glowing spreadsheet of my failures vanishing from the screen, and got the car keys. The drive to the cemetery was quiet. It was a crisp, clear autumn day in Cleveland, and the maple trees that lined the iron fences were ablaze in shades of fiery red and gold. We walked along the neat gravel path to the small, simple headstone that read, "Arthur Jensen, beloved husband, father, and grandfather." Eleanor knelt down, her movements slow and careful, and began to tidy the small patch of earth. She pulled a few errant weeds and used a handkerchief to wipe the dust from the engraved letters of his name. I stood beside her, a familiar ache in my chest. After a few minutes of silent communion, she looked up at me, her eyes clear and resolute. "Your grandfather was a quiet man," she began, her voice steady. "He didn't talk a lot, but he saw everything. He saw people for who they really were. And he worried, Liam. After he got sick, he worried all the time about what would happen to me when he was gone." She paused, taking a deep breath. "He worried about Rick." The words hung in the crisp autumn air. "He loved his son, but he wasn't blind. He saw his weaknesses, his laziness, his sense of entitlement. He saw that your father always looked for the easy way out, and he worried that one day Rick would see me as the easy way out." I felt a lump form in my throat. My grandfather had seen it all, years before it happened. "So," Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on the headstone, "he made a plan, a secret plan, just for me, just in case." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick, worn envelope. A few years before he passed, he met with a financial advisor. He took a large part of his retirement savings, the part that wasn't tied up in the house, and he put it into a diversified stock portfolio. A trust, in my name only. He also made sure the deed to a little duplex we owned over in Tremont, the one we always rented out, was transferred solely to my name. He made me promise I would never speak of it to Rick or Brenda. It was to be my safety net, in case the worst happened. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. A trust? A rental property? Grandma, why didn't you use it? Why did you sell the house? A look of profound sadness crossed her face. "Because I was a fool," she said softly. "Because a mother's hope for her child dies hard. I hoped that if I gave them what they wanted, if I sacrificed for them, that they would finally show me the love and respect I so desperately wanted from them. I chose to have faith in them instead of honoring your grandfather's wisdom. It was a mistake I paid for dearly." She then looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. "But your grandfather was wise in another way too. He knew that if there was one person in this world I could trust, it was you." She handed me a smaller, folded letter from inside the envelope. The paper was old, the creases worn soft with time. It was his handwriting. "He left this for me, but I think he always knew I would be sharing it with you one day. Read it, Liam. Aloud. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. His familiar, strong cursive filled the page. My voice was thick as I began to read. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this alone, it means I am gone, and I hope you are living in the peace you so richly deserve. But if you are sharing this letter with Liam, it means the worst has happened, and you have needed your safety net. Do not mourn the circumstances, my love. I saw this storm coming long ago. I am only sorry I am not there to hold your hand through it. I have left you these provisions not as a treasure, but as a shield. Rick is our son, and I love him, but his character is soft, and his hands are greedy. He does not understand that true wealth is not what you have, but what you build. Do not let him or his wife squander what we spent a lifetime building together. Trust in Liam. I have watched him grow. He has your kindness, but he has a spine of steel that he gets from me. He is a good man. He will know what to do. He will protect you. He is our true legacy. All my love, forever, Arthur. The last words were a blur through my tears. I looked up from the letter, speechless, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't just the money. It was this. It was the voice of my grandfather, reaching across time and death to tell me he saw me, that he trusted me. It was the sudden, breathtaking relief of a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying being lifted. The frantic, late-night calculations, the fear of the next bill, the gnawing anxiety, it all just vanished, replaced by the calm, steady voice of my grandfather. I looked at Eleanor, who was smiling through her own tears. The financial walls were no longer caving in, and in that moment, standing by my grandfather's grave, I felt a new purpose settle over me. This wasn't just a safety net, it was a weapon, and I finally had the power to not just survive, but to build something new, and to seek a justice that Arthur, in all his wisdom, had known we would one day need. The drive home from the cemetery was a world away from the silent, grief-stricken one we'd taken from the diner just a few months prior. This time, the silence was one of peace and profound, shared understanding. Arthur's letter sat on the dashboard, a tangible link to a love and wisdom that had transcended death itself. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a terrifying, uncertain fog. It felt like a path, and my grandfather had left us a map. The next week was a blur of phone calls. I met with the financial advisor Arthur had appointed, a kind, no-nonsense man who had been managing the trust for years. He walked me through the portfolio, the rental income from the duplex, the numbers on the screen confirming a reality I still struggled to grasp. We weren't just solvent, we were secure. That evening, I sat down with Eleanor, a stack of real estate listings in my lap. "We're not just going to survive anymore, Grandma," I told her, my voice filled with a conviction I'd never felt before. "We're going to live. We're going to find you a home." Her eyes filled with a hope I was afraid had been extinguished forever. Our search was short and joyful. We found it in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a beautiful, single-story brick ranch house. It was the antithesis of my parents' cramped, two-story house. There were no stairs for her to struggle with, large windows that bathed the rooms in sunlight, and a small, perfect patch of earth out back that she immediately claimed for her future garden. It was a house built for peace, not for conflict. Moving day was one of the happiest days of my life. I watched as Eleanor directed the movers, telling them exactly where to place her armchair in the new sunroom, a vibrant, commanding matriarch once again. I unpacked the photo of Grandpa Arthur and placed it on the mantelpiece, where he could watch over us. As she stood in the center of her new living room, her hands on her hips, planning her garden, I saw the woman I remembered from my childhood, strong, joyful, and completely at home. But peace, I was about to learn, is often a prelude to war. We had been in the new house for less than 2 weeks when the doorbell rang. I opened it to a sight that made my blood run cold. There on my new front porch stood Rick and Brenda, but they weren't alone. With them was a man I hadn't seen in nearly a decade, my Uncle Greg, my father's older brother. He was a slick real estate agent from Florida, all fake tan, blindingly white teeth, and a predatory, confident smile. He was the family shark, and he only ever swam in waters where he could smell blood, or in this case, money. "Liam, my boy," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder and striding past me into the house before he was invited. My parents followed in his wake, their eyes greedily scanning every inch of the new space. Greg took charge immediately. assuming the role of the smooth, reasonable negotiator. Nephew, this is a fantastic place. I'm so happy for Mom, really. To come into this unexpected windfall. It's just wonderful. He smiled his practiced reptilian smile. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with false sincerity. We were so worried, Liam. When we heard from an old neighbor you were buying a house, we just had to come make sure everything was all right. The lie was so blatant, it was almost impressive. Then came the pitch. Greg leaned against the mantelpiece, right next to Arthur's picture, and laced his fingers together. Look, we all know Dad was a traditional guy. He would have wanted his assets, his legacy, to be distributed fairly among his children. It's the right thing to do. So, what we've done, just to make things easy, is we've had our lawyer draw up some simple paperwork for an equitable three-way split of the estate. Between me, your father, and of course your mother, for all the time she spent as Mom's primary caregiver. The audacity of that last phrase, primary caregiver, was staggering. Brenda nodded eagerly, adding, We sacrificed so much, it's only fair. My father just stood there, sullen and silent, his hand out as always. I let them finish their entire disgusting performance. I listened as they tried to reframe their cruelty as caregiving, their greed as fairness, and their entitlement as legacy. They saw Arthur's shield not as a tool for Eleanor's protection, but as a lottery ticket they had a right to cash in. When they were finally done, the silence stretched. They looked at me, expecting a negotiation, an argument. I gave them neither. I walked over to the desk where I'd left my grandfather's letter. I picked it up. Grandpa Arthur was a lot of things, I said, my voice cold and steady. But he was not a fool. He left a letter explaining his final wishes. A letter he knew Grandma would one day share with me. I looked directly at my father. He said he couldn't trust your character or your greedy hands. My uncle's smile finally faltered. My mother's face flushed a blotchy red. This isn't a family estate to be carved up. I continued, my voice low and final. This is Grandma's shield. It exists for the sole purpose of protecting her from the very people who are standing in this room right now. The conversation is over. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Please leave my house. For a moment they were too stunned to move. Then Greg's face twisted from a smile into a sneer. You think you can get away with this? This isn't over, you little punk, he snarled. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. He stormed out, my parents scurrying after him like jackals. As they left, their final threat hung in the air. But for the first time, it didn't scare me. They had drawn the battle lines. But this time, they were no longer fighting a helpless old woman and a struggling young man. They were fighting the legacy of Arthur Jensen, and it was a fight they were going to lose. My uncle's threat was not an empty one. Less than a month after they were thrown out of my house, the official letter arrived via certified mail. The legalese was dense and intimidating, but the intent was brutally clear. My father and uncle were suing my grandmother, claiming she was mentally incompetent at the time she had granted me power of attorney over Arthur's trust. They alleged undue influence, painting me as a manipulative predator who had isolated a vulnerable old woman to steal the family fortune. Reading their baseless, cruel accusations felt like being covered in filth, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared. I was ready. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Miss Davies, who listened to our entire story with a look of growing, righteous anger. The battle had begun. The day of the trial, the courtroom was cold and impersonal, all polished wood and stern, official seals that seemed to absorb all the warmth from the room. I sat with Eleanor and Miss Davies at one table. Across the aisle sat the unholy trinity. My father, my mother, and my uncle huddled together with their slick, expensive-looking lawyer. My parents wouldn't look at me, but my Uncle Greg shot me a look of pure, venomous hatred. The proceedings began, and the air grew thick with tension. Their lawyer's strategy was exactly as we'd predicted, a cruel, systematic attempt to assassinate my grandmother's character and paint her as a doddering, confused old woman. I was called to the stand first. I recounted the events as factually as I could. My grandmother's sacrifice, my parents' neglect, the incident at the party, and my decision to take her in. On cross-examination, their lawyer came at me with fangs bared. Mr. Jensen, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. Isn't it true that at the time of these events, you were under significant financial distress? That you were, in fact, drowning in debt? He tried to twist my love into a financial motive. my protection into a calculated scheme. I kept my voice steady, answering every venomous question with the simple, unshakable truth. But sitting there, being painted as a villain while my own father watched on with a smug look of approval, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Then they called Eleanor to the stand. My heart ached as I watched her walk slowly, her back straight but her hands trembling slightly, to the witness box. She looked so small and fragile under the harsh courtroom lights. Their lawyer saw it too, and he approached her like a wolf circling a lamb. He started with soft, patronizing questions, trying to trip her up on dates and minor details. "Mrs. Jensen, you loved your son, Rick, correct? And you know he and his wife sacrificed a great deal to take you into their home?" He was trying to build a narrative of her as a confused ingrate, manipulated by her grandson. Eleanor answered his questions in a quiet, soft voice. For a moment, I was terrified their strategy was working. He must have sensed it too, because he went in for the kill. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, leaning closer, "isn't it fair to say that you've been rather confused lately, that your memory isn't what it used to be? Isn't it possible that your grandson Liam put these negative ideas about your own children into your head? That he convinced you they were somehow villains?" And that's when it happened. Something inside my grandmother shifted. The frail, frightened woman seemed to recede, and in her place sat the matriarch I remembered from my childhood. She sat up a little straighter, her trembling hands grew still, and she looked their lawyer directly in the eye. The quiet in her voice was replaced by a clear, ringing strength that captivated the entire courtroom. "Confused?" she asked, the words sharp and precise. "No, sir, I am not confused." She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over Rick, Brenda, and Greg. My memory is in fact exceptionally clear. I remember my husband, Arthur, telling me he worried about his son's character. I remember selling my home, the place my husband and I built our lives, in the hope that my children would care for me. I remember being told my 60 years of memories were senile ramblings. I remember my daughter-in-law throwing away my wedding gifts because I was no longer allowed to feel useful in her kitchen. With every sentence, her voice grew stronger, each memory a perfectly placed stone building a wall of irrefutable truth. My parents sank lower in their seats. My uncle's smug expression had melted into a slack-jawed panic. "And I remember, with perfect clarity, the day of the anniversary party," she continued, her voice now resonating with a power that held every person in the room completely still. "I remember dropping a stack of plates, and I remember my son's wife screaming that I was a useless burden. I remember my own son, my flesh and blood, standing by and watching, his face blank, as she took a pair of clippers and held me down. She didn't need to display the evidence. Her words painted a picture more vivid and horrifying than any photograph. She finally turned her gaze from her children to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dropping but losing none of its power, "my mind is not failing me. I have learned, in this last year, that a person's mind is never clearer than when they finally know who loves them, and who will stand by and watch while their head is shaved as a punishment." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. Their lawyer stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He had no more questions. My father had his head in his hands. My mother was staring at the floor, her face a blotchy, tear-stained mess of public shame. The judge looked down at them from his bench, his expression one of utter contempt. As Miss Davies gently helped my grandmother down from the stand, I rushed to her side, my heart swelling with a love and pride so immense it felt like it would burst. She had not only defended herself, she had delivered the reckoning. It was over. They hadn't just lost a lawsuit. They had lost everything. We walked out of that courthouse and into the bright, cleansing light of the afternoon Sunday. We didn't feel triumphant, not in the way you see in movies. There was no cheering or celebratory back-patting. What we felt was something deeper, quieter, a profound and unshakable sense of peace. The truth had been spoken in a place where it could not be denied, and the weight of the lies, the shame, and the humiliation had finally been lifted from my grandmother's shoulders. As we made our way to the car, one of my mother's cousins, a woman who had stood by silently at the anniversary party, rushed over. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Eleanor, Liam, I am so sorry," she stammered. "I should have said something. I was a coward." My grandmother simply reached out, patted her hand, and said, "The truth has a way of coming out, dear. Be well." She had found a grace that was far beyond forgiveness or anger. She was simply, finally, free. The verdict from the judge was swift and brutal. The case was dismissed with prejudice. A legal term, I learned, meant they could never bring this suit against us again. But the judgment of our small Cleveland community was, in its own way, even more severe. The story of the trial, and specifically of Eleanor's testimony, spread like wildfire through the tight-knit neighborhoods. The story of the shaved head became a local legend, a cautionary tale of cruelty and disrespect. The corner plate diner became a pariah. Regular customers, the ones who had known my grandmother for decades, stopped coming. Old friends of my parents began crossing the street to avoid them. In a working-class town where reputation is currency, they had declared bankruptcy. I heard from a neighbor that, within 6 months, the diner had closed its doors for good. The neon sign was taken down, leaving a ghost of its shape on the grimy brick. They were forced to sell the house, the one my grandmother's sacrifice had paid for, and move into a small, nondescript apartment on the other side of town. They had grasped so greedily for a fortune they felt they were owed, and in the end they were left with nothing. No business, no home, no mother, no son, and no standing in the only community they had ever known. My Uncle Greg had scurried back to Florida the day after the trial without so much as a goodbye. They had become islands, isolated by the consequences of their own choices. I felt no joy in their downfall, only a distant, quiet pity for the emptiness of their lives. 6 months after the trial, spring arrived, and with it, a sense of rebirth. The garden behind our new house, which had been a sad, neglected patch of dirt, was now teeming with life. We had spent the early part of the season tilling the soil, planting rows of tomatoes, and creating a border of my grandmother's favorite white daisies. Her hair had grown out into a chic, dignified silver crop that framed her face with a wisdom and strength that seemed brand new. She had gained weight, the color had returned to her cheeks, and the haunted, fearful look in her eyes had been replaced by a serene, contented sparkle. One perfect May afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch, watching her as she knelt in the dirt, tending to her daisies, humming that same old tune from the 40 Seconds. She looked up at me, shielding her eyes from the sun, and gave me a smile so pure and happy it felt like a benediction. "Arthur would have loved this garden," she said, her voice carrying on the warm breeze. "He always said you could trust the things that grow." I brought her a glass of lemonade, and we sat there together, talking about nothing in particular. The weather, the stubbornness of a particular weed, what to have for dinner. It was the beautiful, precious, simple rhythm of a normal life. As I watched her, I thought about my grandfather's letter. I finally understood what he meant by his true legacy. It wasn't the stock portfolio or the rental property. It was this quiet moment of peace, this feeling of safety. The legacy was the lesson he had passed down, that your primary duty is to protect the ones you love. My parents had been born into a family but had never understood what it meant. They saw it as an obligation, a transaction, a hierarchy of power. But sitting there, in the warm spring sun, I knew the truth. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns dark. It's about who shields you from the storm, who helps you tend your garden, and who sits with you in the quiet, comfortable silence of a peaceful afternoon. It's not something you're given. It's something you build, and if you're lucky, it's something you earn, and I plan to spend the rest of my life earning it.